everyone this morning. I hope everyone has had a good weekend. I remember when I was in college, I was at a rehearsal dinner, and I was sitting by someone I didn't know, and and I was just having some small talk with them, and they asked me what school I went to, and I said, well, I go to Harding University. And they said, well, why didn't you go to this particular school? And she named the school. And while she asked about a particular school, I should have, raised, a flag in my head. But I said, well, because that's really just not a very good school. I've heard bad things about it. I've heard that, it's just not the place that you want to go. And, it wasn't for me. I don't know why anybody would go there. And I said, well, what school do you go to? And she said, well, I go to that school. Well, and so I thought in my head real quick. I was like, okay, I can back this thing up a little bit. And so then I said, well, it's really not the school that I have a problem with. I'm a Bible major, and it's really just the Bible program, because I don't know a whole lot about the school, but the Bible program just wasn't a very good Bible program, and I didn't hear any good things about it, and so that's why I didn't go to the school. She said, oh, and I said, so what are you majoring in? And she goes, well, Bible. It's like, well, nice to meet you. See you later. I avoided her the entire weekend after that. Have you ever misjudged a situation or what someone said or an event or a person, and you really just stuck your foot in your mouth? I know I sure have. And I've learned that a lot of times it is better not to say anything, just to keep your mouth shut, than just to open it up and, just stick that foot in there, because it does not taste very good. And I think especially after 12 years of marriage, I've learned a lot of times we have avoided a lot of conflict in our marriage just because I keep my mouth shut. But at the same time, I think our culture has really shifted in a way where we are so against judging others. I hear phrases in our culture say, like, live and let live. Let's agree to disagree. Hey, don't judge me, right? You hear all these phrases that make it sound like, hey, you just do your thing, I'll do my thing, and we'll just go our separate ways. It doesn't matter, right? I know this is especially becoming true on college university campuses, and this is nothing new, right? They've come out with these safe spaces. And don't get me wrong, safe spaces actually start, I know this is kind of political, and I don't, I try to tread lightly when I go there, but they actually started out so people who were harassed and persecuted could go to a place where they could feel safe. And no one should ever feel harassed or persecuted. But safe spaces have turned into these places where you go to where you don't ever have to hear anything that you disagree with. If someone says something that slightly offends you, then you go to these safe spaces, right? I know that even universities, they're training their professors on how they should speak so they don't offend anyone. This one university was giving a list of things that their professors could not say. One of them was, this doesn't even make sense. This blew my mind when I read it. One was, this is the land of opportunity. They did not want their professors to say that this is the land of opportunity, the United States. Because that might offend someone from another country, saying like, ooh, because their land, if our land is, then maybe their land isn't, right? They didn't, I don't even understand this next one, but they didn't want their professors to say, what was it? It was, that the most qualified person should get the job. I mean, it has gone so far the other way that we are so afraid to say anything that will harm or that will make someone feel uncomfortable, that we're afraid to say anything at all. I remember when I used to go to baseball games growing up and I'd watch TV, I'd see people holding up those big signs. And one of the Bible verses I always saw was John 3:16. That used to be the most popular, the most famous verse in the United States. So people may not know any other Bible verse, but if they knew one verse, it was John 3:16. That's not true anymore. You know what the most popular, the most famous verse is now in America? It's Matthew chapter 7 and verse 1. Judge not, lest you be not judged. Because people want to say, hey, don't judge me. You know, if you want to have a spiritual conversation with someone, say, hey, leave me alone. Your Bible says don't judge. Last week, Chuck preached a fantastic sermon titled, What Love Does Not Do. And he was talking about how love does not let people live in their own sin. And he brought out an example from 1 Corinthians chapter 5. But then we get to Matthew chapter 7. It says, judge not that you be not judged. So what do we do with a Bible passage like this? Because this verse clearly says, judge not that you be not judged. Well, obviously, you just throw away Chuck's sermon from last week, realize that he was wrong, and we just move on, right? We make sure we never say, no. This morning, that's what I want to talk about. I wanted to dive into Matthew chapter 7 and look at the first 6 verses and talk about what does this passage really mean. The verses actually will not be on the PowerPoint this morning because I really wanted to encourage everybody to open up their Bible or to get out their phone and to follow along with me. So we'll be here the entire time. Matthew chapter 7 is page 1278 in my Bible, if that helps you out at all. So verse 1, it says, judge not that you be not judged. And when I read that verse, I think one of the first things that we have to realize is that judging can be, and it is very dangerous. I think he says judge not because he wants us to realize that it's very dangerous to start judging other people. So many times it's so easy for us to judge hastily, to judge with improper motives, to judge a snippet of someone's life without knowing the whole story. So many times it's easy for me to judge myself by my motives while I judge other people merely by their actions. You know, I was in Little Rock yesterday and I was driving and 2 lanes were merging and, you know, I checked my mirrors, make sure I was going good, and I started to merge over in the other lane, and one car happened to be in my perfect blind spot and I didn't see them, and so I kind of cut them off a little bit. And no harm, and I was thinking in my head, no harm, no foul, not a big deal. And I just moved on, didn't think a second thing about it. And I was thinking about that later. I thought, you know, if someone would have done that to me, that's when I, start throwing my hands up in the air and, I might toot the horn a little bit. And then later on, if I was, I might pull up next to them and give them that look like, what are you doing, so easy. It's easy for us to judge ourselves by our motives. But when someone else does the exact same thing to us, it's so easy to judge them and to take them to task, right? I mean, judging can be very dangerous. And so I think this is why Jesus said it, and this is why Matthew recorded it. He says, judge not that you be not judged. He's saying, be careful when you judge others. And I think the key to this is found in verse 2. It says, For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And so I think what he's saying is if we judge hastily, if we judge without knowing all the facts, if we jump to conclusions, if we judge with little grace and mercy, then that's how we are going to be judged also. I read several commentators on this, on verse 2 in particular. And some commentators think that when it says, with the measure you used, it will be measured back to you. Some commentators think that this is actually talking about divine judgment, saying with how you judge others, that is how God is going to judge you on Judgment Day. And so if you judge, hastily without grace and mercy, then that's how God is going to judge you. Other commentators seem to think, well, no, it's not talking about that. It's talking about, well, if that's how you judge, people, that's how people are going to judge you. Kind of this idea of, you reap what you sow. And so how you treat others, that's how those people are going to treat you. I looked at like probably a dozen commentaries on this particular verse, and I never came to a satisfying conclusion about what that exactly means. But whatever it is, whether it's talking about divine judgment or judgment from our friends, all I know is I want a heaping pile of grace, maybe a double or triple portion of grace, maybe doused with some mercy and sprinkled on top with some love, because I know that's how I need to be judged. Whether it's divine judgment or judgment from other people, I sure know that I need a lot of extra grace and mercy. I thought it was interesting, and I think a lot of us learn this as we get older and have more experiences. I remember when I was first started out in youth ministry, and I would have parents come up to me and ask me, well, when is that event again? Or what time does it start? Or what's going on? And I would think in my head, man, it's been in the bulletin for a month. I sent you a text message about it. I've announced it to your kids. How in the world do you not know what's going on? And I would get so frustrated and mad and angry in my head. And then I had kids. And I remember last year, Eden came home from school and she said, Dad, you forgot to put money in my folder for picture day. And I had totally forgotten. But what's worse is I had no clue there was even a picture day. Not only did I forget about the money, I didn't even know about the event at all. I was totally clueless about what was going on. And I realized that, we all mess up. We all make mistakes. And so far be it from me to judge others so many times, because I'm in the exact same boat that they are in. I think the idea, the picture here that Matthew, or that Jesus is trying to give in the Gospel of Matthew, is this idea of this set of scales. And he's saying, what you put on the set of scales, how you judge others, that's the exact same set of scales that's going to be measured back to you. As C.S. Lewis, he said this, and I think it is so true. He said, human beings judge one another by their external actions. God judges them by their moral choices. When a neurotic who has a pathological horror of cats forces himself to pick up a cat for some good reason, it is quite possible that in God's eyes he has shown more courage than a healthy man may have shown in winning the Victoria Cross, which is like our Medal of Honor. When a man who has been perverted from his youth and taught that cruelty is right thing does some little kindness or refrains from some cruelty he might have committed, and thereby perhaps risk being sneered at by his companions, he may in God's eyes be doing more than you and I do if we gave up life itself for a friend. It is well to put this the other way around. Some of us who seem quite nice people may in fact have made so little use of a good heredity and good upbringing that we are really worse than those whom we regard as fiends. Can we be quite certain how we should have behaved if we have been saddled with the psychological outfit and then with a bad upbringing and then with the power, say, of Himmler? That is why Christians are told not to judge. We see only the results which a man's choices make out of his raw material, but God does not judge him on the raw material at all, but on what he has done with it. I know that was a really long quote, But I really like it, and I think what C.S. Lewis is trying to get at is that so many times when we judge others, we hold them to such a high standard, a standard that we could not meet ourselves. And we judge everybody by the exact same standard, when we have to realize that in reality, God does not judge people by the exact same standard. Because to some of us, He has given more gifts to others, and to whom more has been given, more is required. And so many, I know at least for me, I was raised in a Christian home. I was raised with a good upbringing. I was raised going to church and having a solid youth group and a preacher and a youth minister who poured into my life. It should be really hard for me to judge someone who had none of those things growing up, because maybe someone else was dealt with a really bad hand. And I think God judges us differently based on how He has based on our life. Now, don't get me wrong. Sin is still sin, right? He still judges people by their sin. But I think He uses a different set of scales for each and every one of us. And that's why it is so important that we be so careful when we judge. Verse 3 says it this way. It says, "Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye?" And this is what our world loves to get a hold of, right? They love a verse like this and says, you can't judge me because you're not perfect either. Yeah, I have wrongs, but you have wrongs too. And so don't judge, right? I've heard people say, the most loving thing you can do is you just love them, you be a good example, and maybe they will figure it out on their own. I've heard people quote St. Francis of Assisi, who says, go everywhere and preach the gospel, and if you have to, use words. And the ideal people take from that is, well, I don't need to use words. I just go and be a nice person to everybody. And that's all I really need to do. But the problem is we don't do that in any other part of life, do we? If my kids are running out into the road, I'm not just going to say, well, I'll just be a good example for them, and maybe they will learn by my good example that you shouldn't run out. I'm going to grab their shirt and yank them back if I have to. If I saw a blind person walking out into the middle of the street, even if they were a grown adult, and I saw a car coming, I'm going to say, whoa, wait a minute. I don't know if you know, but there's a car coming, right? We don't do this in any other part of life. Say, well, I'll just step back. I'll just be a good example. I'll just show love. And maybe people will just, pick up on what they're supposed to do. And I think the key for this is found in verses 4 and 5. Well, let me just say this first. I think one of the problems has become that preachers have stopped talking about sin. We don't like to use, in general, churches don't like to use the word sin anymore. Instead, we talk about, well, that was a mistake. That was a bad choice. That was a wrong decision. Well, that you don't want to do that because that'll have negative consequences. One of the most popular preachers in America, he's wrote several New York Times bestsellers. He's the preacher at one of the largest churches in America, is Joel Osteen. And he said this. He says that many times he doesn't like to talk about hell, sin, or damnation, or anything that is hard to hear. On an interview for CBS Sunday Morning, he said this. He said, most people are beaten down enough by life. They already feel guilty enough. They're not doing what they should, raising their kids, and we can all find reasons. So I want them to come to Lakewood or our meetings and be lifted up to say, you know what, I may not be perfect, but I'm moving forward. I'm doing better, and I think that motivates you to do better. He doesn't want to talk about sin, doesn't want to talk about hell, doesn't want to talk about the cross, because he just wants to encourage people. And so many times this is what our culture has picked up on. Let's just be encouraging and loving, but let's not confront people with their sin. Like I said, I think the key is found in verses 4 through 6. They say, "Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your own eye,' when there is a log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you." You see, I think what the text is getting at, and I think one of the things we have to understand the differences of, is there is a difference between judging and being judgmental. There's a difference between judging and being judgmental. In a recent survey by non-churched people, the number one way they described Christians, 87% of them described Christians as being judgmental. That was our number one descriptor. 87% said we are judgmental. And whatever we're doing it wrong as a broader church, if this is the number one way non-Christians describe us. I've heard Don Lohman quote it so many times from the pulpit. John 13, 34 and 35. "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. And by this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." If we're to be known by anything, it should be loving others, not being judgmental. And so you ask, well, what's the difference? Well, let me tell you this quick little story. And there was a couple, they moved new into town, and they were trying out different churches, and so they went to one particular church, and they got out and they were talking about it, and the wife said, "Well, what did you think about the church service?" And the husband said, "Well, I thought it was not good at all. We went into the church, and when we got there, only a couple of people talked to us at church. And then when we sat down, the guy who gave the opening, he just kept talking on, and they wouldn't get started. And then the song leader, he was completely off tune, and he led the songs too fast or too slow, and he didn't do it right. And then the preacher got up, and he didn't have enough enthusiasm. I tell you, that church is just not worth going back to." And the husband said, "Well, what did you think?" And the wife said, "Well, that wasn't my impression at all. We went into church, and there was a couple who just kept talking and talking to us, and they were so friendly, so they just wouldn't let go of us. And then we sat down beside them, and then the opening guy got up, and he was just so excited about all that God was doing in his life. He talked, about that for a little bit. And then everybody around us, when they were singing, they were so encouraging, and they were so enthusiastic. And then when the preacher got up, he was dealing with such a delicate and sensitive issue. He approached it with such care and concern." She said, "That church just seems like an amazing church to me." And I think that's the difference between judging and being judgmental. Those who are judgmental, they love to get out their magnifying glass. They love to just look for things that are wrong with other people. They just love to point out the mistakes that they can find. They love to look for all the things that aren't going right. And I think this is what it's like to be judgmental. And so many times we live in a social media world where we love when we see mistakes, when we see faults, we love to post it all over social media, and we love just to bash and to trash and to degrade, what we see wrong. But I think also the answer can be found in these verses also. And let me read them again. It says, "How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your own eye,' when there is a log in your eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." Don't get me wrong, being judgmental is absolutely wrong. But judging, that is completely biblical. How do you know that you have a log in your own eye? You judge. How do you know you have a speck in your brother's eye? You judge. Verse 6 I read earlier says, do not give dogs what is holy. Do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. How do you know if you're giving dogs what is holy? You judge. How do you know if you're casting pearls before swine? You judge. When Jesus is preaching the Sermon on the Mount here and he says, don't judge, in that passage, he's judging all over the place. It is completely biblical to judge, but the important part is how you do it. And I love the illustration that Jesus gives. He says, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then he says, then you'll be able to take the speck out of your brother's eye. And how do you, if someone actually had something in their eye, how would you go about taking that speck out of someone's eye? You don't just go, well, I'm coming in, here I go, right? The eyes are so sensitive. Eyes are so sensitive. I think a lot like us as human beings. And with the utmost care and concern, with the utmost delicacy, would you go in ever so slowly and cautiously to take that speck out of your brother's eye. And I think the same is true when we judge others. Do it carefully, cautiously, with the utmost concern for the other person. In this word here, judge, the Greek word means to judge to a place of condemnation. And this is what I think we're not supposed to do. It is not our job to go up to someone, to wag our finger in their face and just to condemn them. We don't judge to condemnation, but we judge for identification and restoration. We don't go just wagging our finger, telling someone how they're wrong and what all the problems that we have, but we identify, and it is our job to try to restore. And our culture has so swung so far the other way. We don't like saying anything bad. We've set up safe spaces so no one ever has to hear anything they disagree with. But even if you were not a Christian, you should still judge. And there might be some in here who aren't a Christian. There might be some in here who are questioning, and they think to themselves, well, this is just a Christian thing. Judging is something that only Christians do. Well, I would say that I think everybody should judge, because sin, it wreaks havoc on our relationships. It keeps us from being the best mother or the best parent we could, the best spouse we could be. It wreaks havoc on our personal life and at our workplace. It's only when life is not meant to be lived alone. It's only when we have people who come up next to us and are willing to journey along with us and to help move us in the right direction, sometimes by confronting us with the sins in our lives, are we going to be able to become better people and live healthier and happier lives. But especially as Christians, we should judge. Because sin, most importantly, it affects our relationship with God. And continual, habitual, rebellious sin can keep us from spending eternity with God in heaven. It is our job to judge others and to identify and to restore them back into their proper relationship with God. And so if there's anyone this morning who doesn't have that right relationship with God, Maybe yet you haven't put Christ on in baptism for the remission of your sins. Or maybe you've done that in the past and you've wandered away and you realize that I'm not walking right and you need to ask for prayers of the church. Now is a great time to respond to the invitation as together we stand and as we sing.